Let's go through some of the myths, because one of the things I enjoyed from your book was actually puncturing some of those myths we hear so often. So myth number one is that small islands will all be submerged as the sea rises. What's the truth of that?
Well, so it turns out there's lots of researchers who've looked at this. We constantly hear Micronesia, the Maldives or Seychelles or something is going to be flooded. I mean, they're only like 1 meter or 2 meters above sea level. So it makes sense. As sea levels rise, they're basically going to get flooded. What we forget, and what these researchers have done, is they've actually taken aerial photographs from back in the 60s or 40s or whenever they've been made and compared them with the islands today. What happens is most of these islands are coral islands, so they have actually occurred because they break off dead coral when there's storms and wash it ashore. That accretes the island. That makes the island higher. At the same time, of course, sea level rise makes the island lower. It turns out that at least for now, and probably in the foreseeable future, the accretion is higher than the sea level rise. So what you've seen in pretty much all of these, so for all atolls, but probably also for most of the individual islands in these atolls, you've seen increasing areas, not decreasing areas. This is just a fact. And again, it doesn't mean global warming is not real. It doesn't mean that they don't have a problem. If there was no sea level rise, they'd probably be growing even faster. But they're not disappearing, and they're not likely to disappear in the near future or even in this century.
Okay, myth number two. Extreme weather events are on the rise, and they are proof of climate change. True or false?
So extreme weather is typically the argument that most people use for climate change. Some extreme things increase. So you're going to see more heat waves, as we talked about before. You're also going to see more heavy rain. Those are two things that we know are going to happen. For instance, in storms, so hurricanes, you're probably going to see fewer hurricanes, which is actually good, but you'll probably see stronger hurricanes, which is bad. We become much more resilient towards many of these disasters. So as we get richer, we don't get nearly as affected by climate impacts. So what you've actually seen, if you take a graph of how many people die from climate-related disasters, well, we have good data for that for the last 100 years. In the 1920s, about 500,000 people died each and every year from climate disasters. A lot of them were floods and droughts, especially in China and India, that you've never heard of. What's happened since then is it's declined dramatically. So in the 2010s, we were down to 18,000 people, so about 96% reduction in deaths. And last year, it was down to 14,000, so in 2020. And in 2021, we don't obviously have the whole year yet, but it looks like 2021 is set to be even lower at about 6,000.
Myth number three, lockdowns. This is something that we've talked a lot about on this channel. And you hear a lot that 2020, because it was a lockdown year, was a beautiful year for the climate because there was such little flying around and relatively few emissions, and that actually some people, including Professor Susan Mickey, who we interviewed on this channel, are beginning to think about those kind of measures, lockdown-style measures, to combat climate change. What's your view on that?
Well, the first thing to realize is, despite the fact that we shut down the entire world, we still emitted almost as much. So we probably cut our emissions about 6% globally. So by having all this amazing shutdown, we managed to cut carbon emissions just a little. And of course, what's happened is we basically zoomed past that in 2021. So the net impact of climate from 2020 is zilch. It simply, and there's studies that tell us we won't be able to measure this at all, ever.
2020, that extraordinary year where, as you say, the world pretty much shut down, only produced a 6% reduction in emissions.
And that's because we still have to heat our homes. We sat at home and did what we're just doing, zoomed instead and used electricity in that way. So the amazing thing is, and we don't quite get this, when you shut down one thing, you end up doing something else.
Myth number four, electric cars. What is your view of electric cars?
It's going to deliver very little in the short and medium term. In the long term, it's likely that electric cars will be part of the solution. So even when you look at electric cars, remember, yes, they're being sold as net zero, but what they actually are, they're zero when they're driving, but much of the energy that you tank up your car, unless you live in Norway, is basically fossil fuel. And of course, most of the battery is produced, and that takes up a lot more energy, is produced in China or somewhere else where it emitted a lot of CO2 typically from coal-fired power plants. So the reality is the International Energy Agency estimates that every time you buy an electric car, and if you drive it just as much as you would have a gasoline-driven car, you probably save about 10 tons of CO2. So in the EU, that's equivalent to about 600 euros. In the US, it's equivalent to about $60. And yet we spend up to $10,000. Germany is just giving 10,000 euros for each electric car. That's a terrible way. So you cut emissions that are worth maybe somewhere between 60 and 600 euros, and you pay $10,000 for it. That's a really bad idea.
Myth number 5, polar bears. In your book, you say that the number of polar bears is actually going up.
40, 50 years ago, we used to shoot a lot of polar bears. And one of the good things we did was we said, let's stop doing that. So we've probably gone from somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 polar bears up till today, where we have about 25,000 polar bears. That by all means should be a tremendous success for conservation. Instead, most people tell us, but they're all going to die because of global warming. First of all, remember the polar bears lived through, certainly at the last time, there was probably no ice on in the Arctic, which was 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. They lived through that. So clearly it's not the end of the world for them. But also, and I think we need to recognize, we're still seeing a trending upwards of polar bears. And the real thing that just strikes me as so absurd is when people are saying we should help save the polar bear by cutting a ton of carbon emissions. Remember, that will save 1 or 2 polar bears per year. Yet every year, we shoot almost 1,000 polar bears. If you want to save the polar bears, stop shooting 1,000 polar bears first.
Myth number 6, Bjorn, meat. This is one you hear a lot, which is that if we're going to be good, responsible citizens doing our bit towards combating climate change, we should become vegetarian. Eating meat is in some way very bad for the climate. What's your take on that?
Going meat-free is only going to do a little bit for climate. We often hear that, oh, it's 50% of your food intake, and you only hear the 50%, so you can apparently reduce 50%, but it's only 50% of your food emissions. So the reality is, when you look at the total impact, it's about, take the biggest meta study that we have, it's about 4%. So if you cut out all of your meat and become vegetarian, you will cut your emissions about 4%.
Myth number 7, wildfires. So this is a really serious one because we've had, it feels like a really bad couple of years of wildfires. California has had some terrible fires, and Greece similarly has been ravaged by these fires. And a lot of people see those and think, this is global warming, this is climate change becoming real in front of us. What's your sense of the truth of that?
We've actually seen that wildfire has been declining in amount of burnt area pretty much every year since 1900. So from 1900, we only have model estimates. It has gone down from about 4.2% of the Earth's surface to about 3% every year that's being burned. And in the satellite area, we obviously have much, much better data. We have it from 1997 till today. It used to be about 3.2%, and now it's down. So 2021 seems slated to be one of the lowest at 2.5%. And if you look further in the climate models, they also estimate that, yes, if you only look at CO2, you're going to see more fire. But if you assume that people are also actually going to adapt to this, which is what we've been doing for the last 100 years, you will see even lower levels of fire. This is very contrary to what we hear. So also for the US, we've seen declining levels of fire. For Europe, we've seen declining levels of fire. Remember Australia, we've seen declining levels of fire. Actually, the big Australian fire that you saw in 2019-20 that was on the cover of every news magazine and every paper in the world, we now have the satellite data. And what it shows us that yes, eucalyptus forests that are close to where news stations are burnt a lot more. But overall, Australia had one of its lowest burns ever. It used to burn in the early 1900s about 12% of the area of Australia every year. It's down to about 6-8% typically in the early 2000s. In 2019-20, it burnt little less than 4%. It was, according to Australia Environment, it was one of the lowest levels ever.